Well, hello everyone. Mark Harrington here, your radio activist, and thanks for tuning into the program. And you can pick us up on all the popular podcasting platforms and all the social media websites. We're on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and I'm the founder and president of Created Equal, and we take young people to college campuses across America to debate abortion. As you all know, we're fighting this fight here in Ohio, where the pro-abortion advocates are trying to put on the ballot in November a constitutional amendment that would expand abortion up to the very moment of birth. We're going to be talking about that later in the program. But first, we're going to be interviewing author Stephen Wolfe, who is the author of the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And you might wonder, well, Mark, why would you be talking about Christian nationalism on your program when we normally talk about the abortion issue? Well, here's why: because I think theology matters. That's why. And I was given this book, or at least encouraged to read it by my son Dylan, and I picked it up and read it, and then our church did a 3-part series on Christian nationalism, and it's been in the news, I guess, as far as it goes within the realm of Christendom, and there's been a lot of debate about it. And at the heart of that debate is Stephen Wolfe, who's the author, and so I thought I'd ask him to come on the program, and he was gracious enough to take me up on that. Stephen, thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So you're kind of wrapped up in this controversy. I don't think there should be one, honestly. When I ask people, "Are you a Christian nationalist?" they go, "Well, I'm not a secular nationalist. I'm not a pagan nationalist," right? I mean, it seems pretty obvious that we're Christian nationalists, but for some reason, this term Christian nationalism comes with some baggage. And I know in the book you talk about whether you should use the term or not. And then you came around to decide that, yeah, I think this is the right way to describe my position. But when I say Christian nationalism to people, they get the wrong impression. Let's start there. Let's start there. How would you define it? Now, I know in your book you have a great definition. I'm not going to read it, but there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding and confusion as to what Christian nationalism is. I think a lot of people have different definitions, if you will. And I thought to myself, well, let's let the people that are promoting it and the ones that are writing the books about it to define it. So how would you define Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say first of all that I don't really care if people don't use the term Christian nationalism, because it's just a term that I think accurately describes what I'm arguing for. And if they want to agree with the substance of my argument and yet not use the term, that's fine. I have friends who are just like that, and it doesn't bother me at all. Uh,
Mhm.
so I mean, well, I think the reason we're asking this question is that we're very early in kind of a positive case for it. So it's usually was a term of derision. It's at least within the last 10 years. I mean, you go back 50 or 100 years ago, it was actually a positive term
Mm.
used. But in the last 10 years, it's been negative because the word nationalism is spooky and scary, and you attach Christian to it. It
Yeah.
brings up theocracy and Handmaid's Tale and all that. So it was just useful for the left to kind of paint any kind of Christian action as this quote Christian nationalism. So we're early. I mean, if you asked a question like, what does conservatism mean? And then
Mm.
even then, what's the definition of that? Well, you got David French says he's conservative, and you also have people like the late Roger Scruton, who try to define conservatism. So the point being is we have a lot of terms we use freely that actually don't have kind of settled definitions. But anyway, to get to your question, I see Christian nationalism as it's a Christian people or a Christian nation who understand themselves as such. So they say to themselves in a way, we are Christian. We're a Christian people. We have a heritage of faith, and they act in light of that. And they insist upon government that reflects Christian values, Christian duties, Christian ends. And that's what I think Christian nationalism comes down to. So it's a self-conception of we as a people are a Christian nation, And in light of that, we're going to have law and we're going to have our social customs that conform to that. And so the ism of Christian nationalism or the Christian nation ism is not an ideology or something kind of spooky or fascistic or whatever people want to throw at it. It's really
Mhm.
just saying, hey, we as a people are going to arrange ourselves in light of our in light of Christianity through law and custom. So that's basically my definition, and then I spend 500 pages trying to unpack it. Uh,
And you do a really good job of it. You know, in the current context of the, you know, Donald Trump and his presidency and running for reelection and make America great again and all of this stuff. A lot of times, say this phrase, Christian nationalism or nationalism generally, gets attributed to Donald Trump. Um,
mm,
and I like how you in the books kind of make a distinction between what we say is Americanism, if you will, and just Christian nationalism generally. You're not
mm,
necessarily promoting American Christianity or Christian nationalism, right? I mean, that's
mm,
what I like about the book because a lot of people say, well, this is just another attempt to say make America great again, right? Go back to our founding, which I don't think is a bad idea actually. But if you would kind of distinguish the difference there.
yeah, that's very important. So I'm not. What I'm not saying is that America is this unique country to set apart, like as if it's a new Israel that makes it God's country as opposed to England or France or whatever. So I'm not saying anything like that. The common kind of things thrown out by kind of the critics is just stuff I don't actually affirm. But yeah, it's a for what there's like 11 or 12 chapters in it. Only about two chapters deal with the American context, whereas the rest is
Mhm.
just general theory of Christian nationalism, and it's mainly a kind of a discussion of the principles of it. And principles are things that can be applied in different ways given the different circumstances. So, like a Hungarian Christian nationalism is going to look different than a French Christian nationalism. England has a tradition of an established church over kind of a national church. Th- So, a British Christian nationalism would certainly include some aspect of the national church, whereas an American Christian nationalism would include our tradition of religious liberty and disestablishment, or at least quasi. I mean, there's some, there were some early establishments in the early republic, but they weren't certainly to the size and degree of, say, England and other places. But the point being is that Christian nationalism, as a set of principles, well, it'll be applied differently in different places, and that's perfectly fine. So there's I don't argue for a specific, simply just an American Christian nationalism, but that there are these universal principles that are Christian that we can apply in different places in different ways.
And how would you define nationalism itself? I mean, I think in the
Yeah.
book you talk about that we all want the best for the country. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, so what I try to do is I tried to avoid the rabbit hole of what is nationalism. It's usually a debate that's you try to list a bunch of cases and then that
Mhm.
we want to say are nationalist, and then we try to find the commonalities, and then we can develop this 10-point list of what nationalism is. And I tried to avoid that entirely. And I just said, what I asked the question is, what is a nation? Is what I
Mhm.
started off essentially first chapter. What is a nation, or second chapter or whatever it is? I forget
Yeah.
now. What is a nation? And then so nationalism obviously has something to do with what a nation is. So what's the ism? And I just think of that as the nation as a people saying we're going to arrange ourselves for our good. So it's not militarism, it's not racial superiority, it's not some sort of ethnic, I don't know, ethnic superiority or something like that. It's just a nation of people seeing themselves as a certain people who ought to act for their good. And I think in that sense, that's not controversial. So that's
No.
where I try to kind of steer nationalism away from kind of the scary historical elements to more towards this, I think, actually very classical, old, pre-modern notion of a people seeking their good. So that's kind of how I see of national. It doesn't satisfy a lot of critics because they really, really want to paint my theory and any theory that would include the word nationalism as, fascism 2.0 or something like
Right.
that. And
White
they
white
just they
nationalism, right.
Yeah, they can't handle the fact that I didn't deny, like, I didn't go through this series of denials and talk about historical fascism and all that. So I just avoid that entirely, and of course that annoyed my critics, but I don't care. Um, it was just mainly the emphasis on. I think the importance of nationalism now is that I think we, especially in Western countries, we've we've lost kind of the will to live as a people, and there's like
Mm,
almost like like a sort of suicidal, like a national suicidal tendency, where we're kind of just in a way destroying ourselves from within and from without, and the nationalism I think is an important corrective to what we're seeing, and that then people can be more self-assertive as a collective group, as a nation, and resist these more destructive elements of their nation that's coming from it, that's in and that's in it presently and coming in. And like just France, for example, like you see France on fire in Paris. This
mhm,
is all self-caused. I mean, this is
yeah.
essentially France allowing in people who within group together, and they're different, and because they're different, it creates animosity and tension, and because they're not exactly historically French, they cannot integrate well into the economy and society, and so there's animosity and resentment, and this boils over, is all very predictable, is all very predicted several times by people, and yet France just continues it. Same with Italy, other places as well. So it's, I think that the nationalism as I present it now is a good is necessary and corrective that's going to help national survival.
Well, and who doesn't want what's good for their country, right? I mean, I would hope that everyone does. Of course, in America, it doesn't seem like that's the case as much anymore. There are people trying to tear us down. Um, you say in your definition, as best as you do it here, you say in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. I happen to believe what's great for a nation is Christianity. I mean, it's proven itself over the years, and but I do want to center in a little bit of our conversation on what you call cultural Christianity. This is one of the areas where folks attack you on and say that Christians aren't called to change culture. We're called to preach the gospel. We're not given the mandate to change culture. How do you respond to that concern or question?
Yeah. Uh, well, I mean, to love your neighbor, you'd want a well ordered society, and
Mhm.
a well ordered society is one that is a Christian society. I mean, you could have somewhat well ordered societies that are not Christian, but the best it's better for in a way for your neighbor to exist in this kind of nominal cultural Christianity than to live in awful, secularist, pagan society. That's just purely in terms of the earthly benefits. It's going to be better for you to live in a sort of Mayberry, like a Andy Griffith show type setting, even if they're kind of nominal Christian, than living in, I don't know, like some modern day city, or town, any town, in the United States and
Mhm.
elsewhere. So I think it's just a matter of loving your neighbor, and at the same time, I think cultural Christianity prepares people for faith, just like in a
Right.
family. In a family, you may not, if you're typically Baptist, you look for a profession of faith later on in life, and then they'd be baptized. Well, all Baptist households, they set up conditions within their family to kind of lead to that choice, that lead to accepting Christ. So they don't keep religion away and then all of a sudden, okay, now they're 12, let's give them the gospel and see what they do. No, it's from very young age, they're attending all these things. I think society can do that as well.
Yeah.
And I think it would be actually make the family a lot easier in doing its job if your neighbors were not hostile to you. If your neighbors were perhaps nominal Christians, but at the same time you could trust them not to say that men could get pregnant or any sort of nonsense and absurdity, then it actually makes your job as a parent a lot easier. So I think it just seems obvious to me. I understand the fear of hypocrisy, the
Right.
fear of nominal Christianity, But there's just, again, there's the earthly benefits of just a stable, orderly society, and then there's the heavenly benefits of, hey, everyone around you at least is not hindering, at the very least, not hindering your discipleship of your children and yourself as
Mm.
well. And then that
Right.
allows you and others to then disciple them. So there's, I just, it just think seems obvious. And you know, like what's interesting is my critics have actually been somewhat positive on that chapter on cultural Christianity. I mean, some have criticized it, but surprisingly, some people have said, "Yeah, Mayberry seems okay." um, but yeah, it's. I think cultural Christianity would be definitely good for us to return to. But it also takes.
Right.
I mean, it takes a sort of self-assertive. No, we are a Christian town. We are a Christian state. We are a Christian nation. And if we're not willing to kind of put our foot down and say, no, that's who we are, then it's never going to happen. So the point being is it's not just going to happen by having well wishes in society. We actually have to say, no, that's who we are, and we're going to
Yeah.
actually keep it that way.
And it's kind of an and both, right? I mean, you can't have a cultural Christian nation without the preaching of the gospel, right? I mean,
Right.
the one can't happen without the other. You got to have people converted to Christ. We talk about that. You have to change hearts and minds, and the culture will reflect that, right? And cultural Christianity does create space for, as you talk about the, you know, Christian religion. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. You talk about some of the things that civil government can do to promote Christianity. And this is where the rub comes with some folks. They don't believe that people should be coerced, and I don't either. And I've read your book, so I know that you don't either. Coerced into believing Christ or converting to Christianity. What do you believe the civil government can do to promote Christianity without crossing over into becoming a state church? Because that's where people will say, "Hey, this is why we left Great Britain," and we had the War of Independence, for an example.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, no one and no Protestant, even people who we'd call persecutors like Calvin, Servetus, and others, that they all denied that you could coerce people into belief. So no one is saying, let's establish a law that mandates that you will believe in Christ, and if you don't, we'll throw you in jail or something. No one's saying that. I'm not saying that. It'd be wrong for me to say in principle. I think in principle, a government can do a lot. So I think
Mm.
if England wants to have a national church, I think that's permissible, and same with other countries as well. But in the American context, again, we have the tradition of religious liberty, and I think that's a very, I mean, we don't probably have time for this, but it's a very Protestant have religious liberty is a very kind of Anglo, kind of a like a yeah, kind of an Anglo-Scottish type tradition, and so it's been weaved this way. Of course, it's fundamental to who we are as Americans. But I do think, nevertheless, there is room for the government in the United States to do things that support religion in different ways. I think one would be Sabbath laws on Sunday, so that people would
Mhm.
be encouraged to then attend church, and they wouldn't have the distraction of that. Um, it also means that people would have the temptation to work on Sunday. I mean, oh, if I could be a waitress or something on Saturday, and then instead they could go to church. So I think that would be, and that of course that was there've been Sunday Sabbath laws for almost all of our history. So that's not
Right.
another thing. Another thing would be, I think that if we're going to say that we're a Christian people and a Christian nation, then public schools, for example, could have a certain role in a limited role in catechizing, not take over from the church, but kind of what a lot of Christian, like private Christian schools do now. I think we could get to the point. I'm not saying enforce it right now. I'm saying if there's more, if we have kind of a stronger sense of we're Christian people, I think public schools could have a role in religion, with kind of a limited role. And I don't think that violates the First Amendment. I think if you look at the way that the First Amendment originally, and I think
Right.
even to this moment in principle, it constrains the state, or the constrains the federal
Congress.
government, not so much the states. So
Right. And many of the states had state religion before the founding. So,
yeah,
folks, if you want to pick up this book, I very much recommend it. And here's the thing: maybe you've heard about Christian nationalism, and it's just been talked about in certain circles and you've kind of come to the conclusion based on the stereotypes that it means something that it doesn't. The way to find out is to read the book. If you're a skeptic, you need to read the book before you make up your mind about it. And that's the thing. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people hear the term Christian nationalism or nationalism. They equate it to Trumpism or Make America Great Again or white nationalists or all whatever. And you have to read the book to understand it. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything here, but in order to engage in the conversation with your friends and coworkers and people in your church that this may be discussed, you got to hear from the people that are writing about it. And that doesn't mean you should read the other folks as well, but you can pick it up by going to Amazon.com. You can pick up Stephen's book. You can also pick it up at the Canon Press is the other place you can pick it up. Stephen, I want to ask you about, Mr. Bruce, put up the Great Commission, because I wanted to read this. To me, it's like, duh. I mean, it's just, this is Jesus' last words, the commission to the church. And he said that, therefore, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to what? Obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I'm with you, even to the end of the age. To me, this is as clear as day, right? We're called to go and make disciples of the nations, teaching them to obey everything that Jesus commanded us. That's cultural. That's Christian nationalism, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to notice, first of all,
right?
yeah, I mean, it recognizes, first of all, that there are nations. So one of the issues is, are they real or not? Well, all nations, it's
now people say those are people groups, right?
Yeah, like I think they'd be like some kind of people group. I mean, they wouldn't be modern nation states and all that, but it's just they're just human difference out in the world, and of course there are just differences. And so so these are real things, and yeah, that they would obey everything commanded you. Which I think that once you have kind of a sufficient number of Christians in a nation, then they begin over time saying we're a Christian people, and they ought to obey everything commanded. Which includes the full moral law. And so and so this verse, I don't kind of exegete this text in the book, but
no,
this is my friends who are better theologians and biblical scholars will kind of exegete this and unpack it, and make a case for kind of Christian nationalism through it.
Also, I want to ask you about the, what is the difference between, say, Christian nationalism and theonomy? I happen to think that they are one of the same thing. Is that right? What do you think?
So there are people who use the term Christian nationalism who are explicitly theonomous, and I am myself not a theonomist.
Okay.
I think by probably secular.
And if you would, can you give us a definition, or at least a working definition for that?
Yeah, I mean, theonomy, broadly speaking, would be that the Mosaic law in the Bible should be the primary source, like the original source of all civil law. And then there's debates among theonomists about exactly what that means and how that looks and how it would be applied and all that. And there's people call themselves like general equity theonomists and all that. But the idea is that the Mosaic law is the original source, whereas I think that the Bible can inform civil law, and but ultimately the source is going to be natural law, or the original created moral law. So I think that's more of a classical traditional position, or the theonomy, I'd say, is more of a modern kind of 20th century position. But that's the difference. I think practically there's not a huge difference. It's probably more of a theoretical difference between me and them. But that's.
And I don't think they are the same terms, but also you have people saying, "Well, you're just trying to establish a theocracy."
Yeah, well, that's again one of those spooky terms that no one really defines clearly. So, do I want God's moral law to govern society, well, yeah. um, do I want there to be this sort of draconian moral legal system? No. Do I think that we should take into account circumstances, characteristics of the people, historical understanding of itself as a people, and then yes, that's absolutely the case. Like I said before, you apply principles differently given the situation. I think we should be very particular, and as Americans, be Christian Americans, and be or Christian or American Christian nationalists, and
Mhm.
seek something that's properly within the American political tradition.
Another question that comes up in these discussions is how would a, say, Christian nation treat religious minorities? Those are there. Those are there. There's those out there who say, well, this would just punish them. you know, that's not what you promote in in the book. Uh, but how would a religious minority in, say, America or any other Christian nation, if it were to be that way, how would they be treated?
Yeah, in terms of treatment, I mean, I would just take like the 19th century, or I mean, the 20th century United States, early 20th century, where people were, Jews were free to have synagogues, and they vote, they held office, but everyone still knew that this was a Christian country, and also specifically a Protestant country. I mean, Roman Catholics knew very well that they were in a Protestant country as well. So religious minorities were given freedom, and they could participate in all aspects of society. But there still was a common conception that, wait, yeah, this is a Protestant Christian country, and the Protestants were confident enough to say, then it's going to stay that way. I mean, there's a complicated history with all that, of course, but so I know people have this fear because, of course, there is a long tradition of kind of persecuting non-Christians, and also kind of minority Christian groups, and Baptists are anxious
Right.
about certain aspects of a Presbyterian like me talking about Christian national or Christian nations. But I think that, again, our own tradition is that we can have a confident Protestant country, or a confident Christian country, while at the same time extending the kind of the liberties to people who are not Christian. So I
And
do
we're
think
not
there
talking
are.
about compelling worships, throwing people in jail, those
Right,
types
right.
of things, setting up ESG scores against those who don't believe in Christ, that kind of thing, right? I mean, you're not promoting that or anything close to it.
Yeah, there wouldn't be any sort of jail, or yeah, people wouldn't be
Cancel
thrown in jail.
cancel them on call
Yeah,
on with, yeah.
I do think though that it's fair. I think it's fair to say that if you're in a Protestant country, people are going to frown on, or if you're in a Christian country, people are going to frown on someone who's like an outspoken atheist, or someone who wants
Right.
to subvert the kind of the Christian foundation, the Christian self-conception. But if people live here peaceably, and they don't try to subvert the kind of the order of society, then they're perfectly free to. And this was true for, broadly speaking, for religious minorities in the country. So, but I do
Well,
think, I
it'd be
mean,
like if I went to Egypt right now and I lived in Egypt for a couple of years, I would feel a little bit separated or alienated from Egyptian culture for obvious reasons because I'm not Muslim, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's kind of a
Yeah, I mean,
natural
that's kind of an
outworking.
analogous situation where you have a self-confident Muslim nation, and I know there's some persecution kind of under the law or outside the law that happens in these places, but in the sort of Christian American Christian country I'm thinking of, it is a self-confident Christian country. It will kind of kind of like, it'll I guess look down upon anything that would subvert that, but still at the
Mhm.
same time not actively seek to persecute people who are,
Right.
in themselves don't not the
So do
same.
you think that would alienate people from coming to Jesus, or it would compel them to look into the claims of Christ? Because I think there are folks out there that say cultural Christianity is just gonna create a bunch of fake Christians, and then those who are non-believers are gonna be kinda left out in the cold, and they won't be reached with the gospel.
Yeah, I think that's kind of this modern concern that is not historical, because there was, I would say that it was Christianity's confidence in itself in places that led to people converting. It wasn't this, like you just say,
So you
like, I
don't
mean,
describe to the opposite happening, because I hear that from folks saying, when things get worse, people turn to Christ, and I'm like, "Well, no, I go to college campuses and things are so bad right now, they are not open to the gospel." When we can't even define what a woman is, they're not gonna be open to what Jesus said about marriage. They're not gonna be
yeah,
open necessarily to what God said about male and female. It seems like they've closed their minds, and as things get darker, it's harder to reach people, not easier. Uh, so I don't know. That's one
yeah.
of
I
the
mean,
critiques I hear.
well, I just say, yeah, this again, cultural Christianity kind of makes it so that the central issue is you exercising true faith in Christ. Whereas now you go on a college campus, you got to start from the very basic, which is that, men cannot get pregnant. So because I mean, you can go to accept Christ, and then they say, well, but then I'm going to have to then discriminate based, of transgender people, and so you have to deal with a lot. Whereas in cultural Christianity, it's you saying, "Hey, you affirm all these things already, but now you need to actually have true faith." So, yeah, I just think it's like people want to say, "Well, the gates of hell will not prevail against the kingdom of God." They want to say that, but historically, it is the case that severe persecution has eliminated over time the church in different places. Of course, the church on earth is perpetual, will always exist, and um, until Christ comes again. But there have been severe persecution has essentially wiped out the faith in certain areas before. I mean, one
Mhm.
would be the example of 17th century Japan. Is kind of the classic example of where there was kind of a thriving uh, Christian communities in different places in Japan, and then they just put their kind of hammer down, and it essentially was eliminated within a couple of decades. Um, but anyway, the point being, I think it's a very modern notion that if we don't have kind of this public, like if we lack public confidence, that makes the gospel more attractive. Whereas I think actually having public confidence in our convictions, to see the world in line with the moral law, and to see the kind of the fruits of that I think actually is more compelling in an earthly sense, not a spiritual sense, but an earthly sense. That's more compelling for people to become um, Christian than actually seeking our own kind of persecution and you know
My guest today is
yeah.
Stephen Wolfe, and he is the author of this book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, and I recommend it to everybody listening or watching the program today. You can pick it up on Amazon.com or on the Canon Press website. And if you're listening to this and this is, kind of piquing some interest, I just exhort you to read the book. And, in Acts chapter 17, verse 11, we are exhorted to be good Bereans in that we should examine the scriptures to see what is true. So just don't listen to one side of this debate, friends. I mean, listen to both sides. Make up your own mind. That's what I'm doing, and I exhort you to do. That's what this program's all about: presenting the information, not being too biased on one side or the other, or falling for stereotypes, or using straw man arguments to try to defeat your opposition. That's not what we're about here. So I exhort you to get this book and read it. Stephen, I know we're running late here, but I have one more question for you. I hear this as an argument. People will say, oh, Christian nationalism has been tried and it's failed. And they'll point to, Constantine or Charlemagne or, those types of examples. How do you respond to that? I don't know about you, but if you want to consider America was once a Christian nation, I don't think we failed too badly. We've existed for over 200 years, and there's been a lot of good that's come out of this country. But how do you respond to that? That it's been tried and failed, and it won't work again if we try it again.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have to I mean, we have to first of all think of, well, what's the alternative? I think you mentioned this
Mm,
earlier. Is it
yeah.
what we're seeing is kind of this? we're seeing a type of nationalism at work right now. The elites pushing a certain
Yeah.
bizarre rights, or, RITS, bizarre morality, pushing just utter absurdity upon us. And this is actually this comes after the United States, the Americans essentially stopped thinking of this country as a Christian nation. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we thought of ourselves as a Christian people up into the 1950s and 60s and beyond. And it wasn't until I'd say the 70s, 80s, and now we're seeing the fruit of it. We've actually completely abandoned that notion or conception of ourselves. And so, really, the absurdity that we're seeing is essentially the fall of Christian America. And so we're seeing the alternative occur right now. It is true that in the past there are examples, and broadly speaking, things were not always pretty. They were not perfect, but I think that's just simply that reflects the fallen world that we're in. So I think we have to be realistic about what we can achieve, what we will achieve. Nevertheless, I think in terms of alternatives, it's much better to have a Christian people with Christian laws, with Christian self-conception, Christian social customs. And I think we would all prefer that. It's interesting, like I mentioned earlier, that the cultural Christianity chapter that I was actually praised by even like a lot of my critics. But they don't seem to realize that takes this kind of self-confidence. It takes a sense that that's what we are, and that's what we're going to be, and we need to recover that. But I do think it's a legitimate objection. Like, oh, we've tried it and it's failed at every time. But I think again, we have to consider first that nothing's going to be perfect, and we ought to strive for the perfection. But we know it's going to be imperfect, and things are going to be messy. That's politics. But again, what is the alternative? The alternative is the
Mhm.
utter absurdity that we're seeing right now. It's the
Right.
descent into this kind of mad neo-paganism on
Mhm.
the left that's being imposed upon us from above.
Yeah,
And I think
pagan
that,
nationalism,
yeah, it's
right?
essentially like a sort of pagan, weird. I mean, I don't know, like even the pagans of old would find some of the stuff utterly absurd and bizarre. But that's what we're descending. I mean, it's almost like a sort of post-Christian paganism where it has some signs of Christian morality abused with added absurdity. And so anyway, again, I think it's a matter of what would you prefer? Would you prefer to live in the ideal of a type of Mayberry society where it's high trust, it's Christian, not perfect, or would you prefer to have a neighbor whose kids are purple haired and confused about their gender and now hate you because you're?
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, that's the question.
Seems
Um,
pretty obvious to most,
yeah,
um, but,
yeah.
yeah, I hate to keep you, but I actually do have one more question.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I don't wanna go down the rabbit hole of eschatology per se, but I think it does animate our worldview, and I happen to not follow the futurist viewpoint that we're living in the end times and that, things are only going to get worse. I don't believe that. I don't think the Bible teaches it. I think that does have a lot to do with your viewpoint on this topic. Could you speak to that just a bit? I'm not out to alienate people who have different
Yeah.
eschatological viewpoints because I think you can be a Christian nationalist and you don't have to be, X, Y, or Z when it comes to eschatology per se. But in some ways, you do kind of line up, you know. I happen to believe that things will get better towards the time of the return of Christ. That doesn't mean it's always going to get better or it's going to get better from here forward. I think history ebbs and flows as far as better, whatever that means, that more Christian, less Christian. I happen to hold to that view, but that doesn't mean things are only going to get better. I just think towards the end, when Jesus returns, I think we're going to see the fulfillment of the Great Commission. That's what I believe. There are those who believe something very different, but they tend to fall into these camps when it comes to this topic. Uh, again, this is a big question, but and I don't know if you want to go there, but I'd be interested in hearing your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. It's I decided to actually approach it from a different angle away from kind of the question of
Yeah,
eschatology. So you'll notice in the
right.
book, I think I mentioned near the end that I actually kind of avoid the whole topic entirely. And this is it's because it's a instead of a work I say it's instead of a work of Christian political theology, it's Christian political theory. So it has more of a
Yeah.
philosophical foundation to it,
Yes.
or methodology to it. And so I just think that that we as Christian human beings can order our society and politics according to God's moral law. Um,
Mhm.
and so I don't focus on kind of the eschatological part of it, but I would be more like actually all millennial, optimistic all millennial. People are surprised by that. They assume I'm
Mm.
a post millennial, and actually
Yeah.
I'd say with among people who are in this kind of my camp, it's kind of a split. There's and yeah, there's all mill and post mill people kind of in the. And I think there's some pre mill people too, which is weird, but I mean it's interesting, I guess. But yeah, I just think about like my view is regardless of your eschatological view, if we're actually going to bring about a Christian nation, Christian nationalism, it's going to require us to actually bring it into existence. I mean, there is, of course, the preaching of the preaching of the word from the pulpit that converts hearts. But at the same time, as I presented, if it's a matter of law and custom, and the people kind of conceive themselves as Christian, that requires us to have the confidence to say this is who we are. It requires us to say we're
Mhm.
going to enact law to that end. It requires us saying these are going to be this is sort of way of life that we have. And that's us having kind of the will to say to make that happen. Um, and so whether you're all mill or post mill or pre mill or whatever you want to see a Christian nationalism or Christian nation, we have to but I mean, by the grace of God, it's still the human, like it's still us saying we're gonna make it happen. I think sometimes there's this tendency among like maybe post mill people and others too to think that it's all just gonna kind of happen spontaneously from just simply the work of the spirit apart from
Right.
human will and human action. And I think there's a kind of cooperation involved here where there is the
Mhm.
grace of God that changes our hearts, that sanctifies us, and that leads us to will what is good. And I think that's so. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly
No,
enough,
you
but
you are.
but that's what it is. I think the big hang up is not us kinda getting our eschatology all lined up properly. I think our problem is just the lack of saying, "We're gonna make it happen," um,
Mhm.
and
And when you make it
relying on
when you
God.
say make it happen, you don't mean imposing it. You mean, in a representative government, we have to win elections, we have to promote the right people, we do still have to win hearts and minds, right? I mean, that's part of it all. That's what we
Yeah,
do here
well
at Created Equal, of course, right?
yeah, and what I mean to say is that we still have several states in this country that in which the majority are Christian or at least identify Christian in the sociological sense. And
Mhm.
it's a matter of I think persuading those people to say, hey, it's not just kind of voting these like single issue kind of votes, but also we should think
Mm.
of our state as a Christian state. We should think
Mhm.
this is how we want to understand Texas, how we want to understand Louisiana or North Carolina or wherever as this state, despite what's happening in Washington and the coasts, this state's going to be a Christian state according to the heritage of faith of America. Um, so it's a matter of convincing those people to have the confidence to do that because I think that that's one of the problems is we can't organize and conceive of ourselves in that way. And uh, yeah, so yeah, not imposing. It's not as if it's like this Bolshevik revolution where it's like a
Mhm.
minority that suddenly imposes communism upon everyone, or imposes Christian nationalism upon everyone. It is still an organic kind of grassroots effort in
Of
which
course, has to
people
be.
will recognize the need for this and the good of it as well. That it is a proper response to moral insanity
Mhm.
that's being kind of in a way. I mean, I know I'm kind of ranting a little bit, but
That's okay.
in a way, we are the America is like in a sort of occupied. We're
Great.
occupied by a foreign empirical power uh, that controls. I mean, it's hard to think of it this way because we look at Washington and they're Americans. They're kind of one of us. They seem to come from us and all that. but it is in a way analogous to an occupation where they
Yep.
come here and they say, we're going to change everything about your way of life, the way you think, your religion. We're going to kind of subvert everything that what made you who you are. And so there's a kind of that center, which is kind of New York and Washington, and they impose that upon us as if they're occupiers. And I think that's a good analogy to hopefully wake people up and thinking, no, wait, we have to, as Christians, oppose that and use the federal the Federalist doctrine, the constitutional doctrine of federalism, to use state power in opposition to some of the kind of insane things coming from the American regime.
Right. And I often refer to us being in a land war, not a guns, bullets, tanks type of war, but where we have divided states, free states, slave states, kind of a setup now.
Mm.
And we have to look at how we would actually make advances, how we might need to strategically retreat in order to, consolidate our resources so we can advance once again. So I think that's, you and I think very similarly on that. My guest has been Stephen Wolfe. He's the author of this book right here, The Case for Christian Nationalism. And friends, if you have any curiosity about this topic, it's been, talked about in a lot of Christian circles, online, and in your churches more than likely. You need to pick up the book. Be a good Berean and search the scriptures to find out what is true. Don't just believe what you hear on social media or in your chats or whatever you talk about with other folks. Get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And Stephen's really written, I think, an excellent book here. It's going to challenge you. It challenged me for sure. And you're talking about a guy who's a cultural warrior, has been in this battle for 20 years or more. So, Stephen, thanks for being on the program, friends. You can pick up the book at Amazon or Canon Press. Stephen, again, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed the interview with Stephen Wolfe, author of The Case for Christian Nationalism. Be a good Berean. Search the scriptures to find out what is true. And when you hear this word or phrase being used or bantered about, now you know, if you've listened to Stephen, you got it from the source. One of the main proponents of this concept of Christian nationalism. And also look at the other side, those who are opposing it, and make up your own mind. I find it extremely stimulating. I love politics to begin with, and political theory. So I think Stephen's a bright mind, but maybe we don't agree with everything that he proposes. But there's a lot of good there, and I think we need to be those who are trying to figure out what to do as we go forward. Without vision, the people perish, right? So anyway, go and pick up his book at Amazon or Canon Press. To wrap it up today, I want to talk again about this August 8th election, this special election, which we are facing here in the state of Ohio. On August 8th, we have an opportunity to raise the threshold to amend the Ohio Constitution to 60%. Currently, it's at 50% plus one, and we're working hard to get out the vote. People can now go out and vote in the early voting centers. You can vote by absentee ballot, and you can vote on Election Day here in Ohio. So if you live in Ohio, make sure you get this done. Vote yes. Vote yes on issue 1 on August 8th or before with early voting. So that's important. Why? Because we don't want out-of-state special interests and money interests buying a piece of our Constitution. We need to protect it. The Constitution in Ohio or anywhere else is not a policy document. That's left for the legislature. When it comes to issues like abortion, for an example, or minimum wage or gambling or marijuana or any number of issues that are considered more policy-making decisions, those should be left to legislatures through their constituents to decide. And so we need to defeat this on August 8th. I'm sorry, we need to win on August 8th. I'm even confused, so that we can defeat the amendment that will likely be on the November ballot here in Ohio. And if you don't live in Ohio, you can still help out. And that is, you can send us a gift at Created Equal, by going to createdequal.org/donate. And you can help support our door-to-door canvassing, which we are currently doing. Our displaying of banners on overpasses. By the way, I'm going to be on the road next week doing that with our staff and interns. We're also doing public outreach in public squares in cities across Ohio. And of course, we're deploying our LED video screens. So you can help out, whether you live in Ohio or not, by giving us a gift at createdequal.org. We'll see you next time. God bless you. God bless America. And remember, America, to bless God.
You've been listening to Mark Harrington, your radio activist. For more information on how to make a difference for the cause of life, liberty, and justice, go to createdequal.org. To follow Mark, go to markharringtonshow.com. Be sure to tune in next time for your marching orders in the culture war.